I'm waiting for something bad to happen all the time. So I'll be happy when I'm not here, when I'm not mayor, and I can enjoy some stuff.
I'm Quinn, and I'm in your house. I'm joined today by Reverend Todd Johnson, pastor of First Emmanuel Baptist Church in North Philadelphia and former state Senate candidate for the 4th District of Pennsylvania for the Republican Party. So Todd, I want to thank you for coming on today. I appreciate you for making time in your busy schedule. Not to be too cliche here, but let's just jump right into things. Why don't you tell me a little bit about yourself, your work as a pastor, how you got started there, and maybe how that impacted your decision to run for office?
Okay. Good morning to you, Quinn, and to your staff. I'm a lifelong resident of Philadelphia, born and raised. The only time I was away from the Philadelphia area is when I was in undergrad at Geneva College. So I was away for about 4 years and then back, reacclimated myself back to Philadelphia. I've lived on the same block for the past 50 plus years. I'm a resident of West Oak Lane, which is directly across the street from the LaSalle University community. I always knew as the neighborhood changed that there was going to be problems, because when you see problems in your neighborhood, that's just a microcosm of what is going on throughout the entire city, because Philadelphia is a city of neighborhoods. So I could identify from a neighborhood perspective what was the breakdown. So I decided to run because as I saw my community breaking down, I knew there were two things I could do. I could complain and gripe about it, or I could actually try to be proactive and do something that I thought would make a change. My church is in the north central part of Philadelphia, so it's about 15 minutes from where I live. So the area where my church is much more challenging in terms of crime and abandonment, and the breakdown of the nuclear family is much more prevalent in that area than it is where I actually live. Although where I live, you can see similar breakdowns. They're just not quite as systemic. But that was my decision to run, to want to make a difference. I had no idea, no inkling that I would win. I wasn't delusional, because as a Republican, I know it's just hard to win anything in Philadelphia, because most of your large cities are Democratic cities.
Right.
But I still wanted to run and to have a message that was offer an alternative to what was being espoused by the dominant party in my city. Having said that, I'm of the opinion that Philadelphia's crime rate, as it is now, is at an epidemic proportion, and something has to be done, and that something is not just one fixed solution, but there has to be several things that have to be done.
And I honestly think that's a great segue to the topic of our discussion today is crime, violence, and education. And I think your answer there is very on brand and something I would definitely expect from you, having worked with you in the past and knowing you the way that I do. It's a good time to actually address the elephant in the room here.
Is that me?
Well, it could be either of us, I
okay.
suppose. You're quoted as saying that you would be amazed at some of the places in Philadelphia where I've been vilified for being a black conservative. As you know, we're always demonized. To me, it's very clear what you mean by that. But for those listening, watching, doing whatever, would you mind explaining what that means to you?
In a nutshell, if you think of some of the caricatures that black conservatives have become, for instance, Clarence Thomas is not very popular in most communities because he's conservative and because he thinks alternatively to what the masses have been taught. Clarence Thomas is just a microcosm of any black conservative, whether he's in the city or whether he's in a area, rural or suburban, they generally are looked at as a sort of like something you would put in the zoo. Let's put it behind a cage and let's poke fun at it because this is something that we don't see much of. But actually, that conservative message, I like to say I'm a traditionalist. I believe in the nuclear family. I believe in law and order. I believe people ought to have personal responsibility for their own actions. I believe in the fact that the neighborhoods, cities, and your states are to be responsible and meting out justice to those who break the law. As well as I believe that we need to create and foster communities where we try to insulate ourselves from the crime and the violence. And how's that done? It starts early in school. It starts in elementary school where you teach people to respect the flag, teach people to respect authority, teach people to respect people of all colors. For example, CRT, critical race theory, which is being taught in many of the public schools throughout the country. It demonizes people. It teaches people that are white that you are irreparably cannot be repaired because you are evil, and it teaches black people and people of color that you are a victim and that no matter what happens in your life, you're a victim and you're not responsible for what happens to you. That's a god awful message because one, it's a lie, it's not true. And then if I'm a person who always claims victimhood, then I can do whatever I want to do and not be held responsible for my actions. And if I think that every white person is a white supremacist, devil, and all that kind of nonsense, that teaches that all people, regardless of color, ought to be judged based on their color. And that's just the opposite of what Martin Luther King taught. He taught people ought not to be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character.
Right. That's very true. And like you said, you live in the city, you have your whole life. It seems many of the issues that have impacted Black Americans and by and large urban communities, poverty, crime, education, and even hyper-policing, they're right on your doorstep. And so you've briefly discussed the conditions of the city, but what do you make of it in the context of being a Black American?
What I make of it is that when I look at law enforcement, when I look at those who are social workers and those who are part of the bureaucratic system that are supposed to have safeguards and safe rails for communities, I look at those individuals as people who first should come from the community which they serve. If they're not from those communities, then I think they ought to be well acquainted with those communities so that they know what they're dealing with. For example, when you think of the inner city, you think of blacks and Hispanics and other people of color, you think of crime and so forth, but the vast majority of people who live in these neighborhoods are not committing crimes, are not perpetrators of violence. It's the few that are, the 10%, 20% that are committing the crimes that make it bad for the other 80% law-abiding citizens who become trapped in these communities because they don't perhaps have the wherewithal, financial wherewithal, to move out of those neighborhoods. But I don't think moving out is a solution as much as affecting from within. If I could leave my neighborhood now, I could sell my home and move out to the suburbs and have a very decent, a better life than what I have now. But if I run from the community and leave where I have my roots, what am I saying to the young Black Americans who are coming up, elementary school, high school? What are you saying to them when you become successful, when you graduate from college, as I've done, when you go into grad school, I've done? Then you ought to move out of your community because it's no longer safe and so forth and so on. I don't think that's a good message to send. I think a better message to send is that you can stay in your respective neighborhoods, make a difference, and drive out the criminals and drive out the perpetrators of crime and violence and intimidation, drive them out of the neighborhood and put them where they belong, which is in incarceration.
And so you kind of point out the bureaucracy and I guess the more administrative positions in the city. And so my question for you out of that would be, do you consider Larry Krasner to be a derelict district attorney?
I do. I very much do. And I think that he has been harmful to the city by letting criminals go. For example, when a person goes into a store, if they're shoplifting, they ought to be locked up because the message we want to send is that stealing is wrong on any scale. But Larry Krasner and his bureaucrats have said, if a person's stealing and it's $100 or $200 worth of merchandise, we're not going to convict them. Don't chase them down the street. Don't lock them up. Just let them go, and hopefully we can do some loss prevention. That is not the right message to send. So Larry Krasner and his ilk, because he was a Soros-backed DA, George Soros backed him up with his money and got him in office. Those type of DAs who are all throughout the country are sending the wrong message that it's okay to commit crime, it's okay to denigrate your own neighborhoods, it's okay to run afoul of the law, and nothing will be done because the district attorneys of these respective cities, i.e. San Francisco, New York, Chicago, et cetera, are not going to enforce the law where you're concerned. And it sends the wrong message because the very neighbors and residents, Black Americans who live in those neighborhoods, become the victims of these people who are committing crimes but are never going to be seriously incarcerated.
Right, like a total disregard for consequence. I hear you. I think that these kind of policies and movements are grounded in well-intendedness, but I think, like we can point out, as with a million other things, well-intendedness means nothing when it comes to positions that require good results. And, Larry Krasner did clear house of anybody that would have challenged his application of the law. Any prosecuting attorneys that would have challenged him were fired, dozens of them. After doing that, Krasner's office released a statement reading, change is never easy. District Attorney Krasner was given a clear mandate by voters for transformational change, and today's actions were necessary to achieve that agenda. So, this guy came in wanting to apply Reconstructionist policies, and instead of changing route when the results proved otherwise that it was working, he instead doubled down. And so out of that, I guess my question for you, while you're opposed to his policies, do you see any room for reform, either in terms of nonviolent crimes like stealing or drug-related crimes, or you pretty much think we need to keep things the way they are?
I think there needs to be change and reform, but I don't think we need to make drastic reforms. We don't need to make radical reforms. The reformations that I see as a person who's a lifelong resident is that we need to have some type of stopgap. For example, when somebody commits a non-violent act and they're incarcerated, while they're in their incarceration, they need to give back to the communities which they have vilified, the communities which they have perpetrated their crimes. They need to clean up those blocks. They need to pick up trash. They need to volunteer and work in the rec centers and help young people who are at-risk youth. So they need to give back to the very communities that they have perpetrated their crimes upon. But that's not done. Often incarceration is just a way of having people sit around and do nothing productive, and then they're not made to reflect upon what they've done and the harm that they've caused to the communities.
Wow. I think that is a sentiment that's being more prominent today, where one, I think in a lot of instances you're talking a lot about community, at least you're implying it, and I think what the left has done, particularly in terms of the racial arguments, is they've kind of turned community into this abstract thing. What would you say to people who say that Black people are disproportionately targeted by police, or at least the criminal justice system?
I would say this. If they feel that Blacks are unjustly being perpetrators of crime or being targeted in their neighborhoods, to some degree that may be true. However, if you're not committing crimes, if you're not perpetrating crimes, you don't mind getting stopped. For me, I don't mind getting stopped and frisked. Why? Because I'm not committing any crime. So if the cop stops me and says, hey, where are you going? Why are you in this neighborhood? Or I have no reason not to comply. It's the criminals who object to being stopped and frisked because obviously they have something to hide. And the good intending liberals who say, oh, no, you shouldn't stop people. Yeah. The program was working. Stop and frisk actually worked, and the crime dropped by 30% when we did stop and frisk. When Krasner comes in and says, "Okay, we're no longer going to do that. We're going to stop. We're going to let people go on about their business," crime actually rose because people know cops were not going to indiscriminately just stop me for any reason. So, having said that, Black Americans, many of whom are not committing crimes, are not violent, and so this lie about Black people are more insidious and are perpetrators of crime. I think it was Hillary Clinton who said they're super predators.
Right.
She made that remark. That's a lie. Most are law-abiding citizens who want to just go on with their lives and be left alone. However, it's always the few and who get the squeaky wheel gets the oil. So by that I mean those people who are committing crimes and doing violent crimes make it bad for the entire neighborhood, as well as the people-based policies based on that 20%. And I think that's the wrong approach that Soros and Krasner and that particular ilk have done. They have made crime worse, and they've made the communities worse. When you ride around Philadelphia now and look in certain communities, you see the devastation. You talked about drugs. Look in Kensington. That most of the people who are being affected from heroin and the other drugs that are being used are whites for the most part. So when I hear people say, "Oh, well, people, whether they're white or black, don't need to have safe injection sites. They need to get off of drugs. They need to have addiction programs where we can wean them off of drugs and get them reacclimated to their communities and get the education that they need. We don't need safe injection sites." Because all that's doing is fostering a community of people. Say, "Oh, go ahead. If you want to get high and shoot up a needle in your arm in the middle of Broad Street, we're going to make a safe spot for you. We're going to have a site where you can go and all you guys can get high." That's not helping.
Right.
That's hurting.
And I think there's it's just a total disregard for consequence, right?
Yes.
And I mean, you briefly talked about the nuclear family there and about the degradation of the family unit. Do you think that this disregard that criminals or even just people who live in this area or in your area have, when a police officer stops them, and I guess coupling that with the anti-police sentiment, that maybe they're not going to respond well to the officer because they have no regard for consequence?
Some, yeah. And I would say there are few and far between. Most people of color, especially if you're talking about over 50 years of age, they're not going to give the cop a hard time. They're not going to be screaming and hollering profanity and telling the cop, "Oh, what are you stopping me for? Get a so-and-so away from me." Now, most people are not going to be confrontational. It's usually the criminal element of our society that are going to react violently. Because most people, when they get stopped by the cop, they want to go home in one piece, and they want it to be a peaceful interaction. Well, for example, I don't know if you know the comedian Chris Rock. Chris Rock does a video. You should check it out on YouTube. How not to get your behind kicked by the cops when you get stopped, and it's specifically he does it in a comedic fashion. But what he says is, when you get stopped, comply. If the cop asks you for your license, give it to him. If the cop asks you to step out the car, peacefully step out of the car and put your hands up or what have you, to prevent from an altercation or situation escalating into something that becomes unwarranted. So again, I believe that Black Americans, and I use the word Americans because we're Americans first. I'm an American first. My color or my ethnicity is second. I'm an American, and I believe in the U.S. Constitution and Bill of Rights, and I believe that when we look at ourselves and view ourselves as Americans first and not as white, black, and Hispanic or brown or beige or yellow or red or whatever color we might use, when we see ourselves first as Americans and as citizens of the greatest country on the face of the earth, I think our perspective changes and we start to look at law enforcement as our friends and not as our foes.
I think that's a great response to that, honestly. I hear you out there. And so, maybe target isn't the right word, right? Maybe there's a more appropriate way of looking at it in the net. Black communities are disproportionately targeted by crime, or not crime, by economic disadvantages, whether that's because of past racism, we know that. But I do worry as crime increases, we're empowering a very strong police and surveillance state that I perceive down the line, especially when we take COVID into perspective here, could be an ultimate affront to our rights. Philadelphia mayoral candidate Sherelle Parker has actually proposed that she's going to deploy hundreds of police officers on the streets of Philadelphia as a means of curtailing crime. And so my big question for you is, and I mean, I think I already know your answer here. You think that's going to have a direct impact on the type of crime that's being committed and how much of it is being committed?
I honestly don't know at this point, but I think putting more police on the street is a deterrent for certain kinds of crimes. I do think having more of a police presence in our communities is helpful if the community understands why the police are there, and if the police have a community sense of that these are our neighbors and these are people we want to interact with, and we want most of our interactions to be pleasant and not to be adversarial. So I think the cops have to have certain kinds of training where they understand, hey, you're policing a neighborhood not as a Gestapo, but you're policing a neighborhood so that you can keep peace, make peace the forefront and not violence. So therefore, get to know the people that you are policing. Get to know their first name. Get to know what types of jobs they have. Get to know how long they've been living in the neighborhood. What perhaps aspirations they have for their kids or grandkids, and having that personal relationship with them, understanding that these are human beings on both sides. Cops are not pigs; they're human beings. The people in the neighborhoods are not people who you want to, use certain kinds. I won't use the language that people use, but the kind of language that people use about people of color and about people who are economically disadvantaged. No, they're human beings first, and they're Americans. So when we look at each other from that perspective, I think we could keep down on a lot. And then we want the cops to be able to go in these communities when things do happen and get the cooperation from the neighbors that they deserve. Because a lot of crime could be solved, but a lot of the neighbors are fearful to say what they've seen so-and-so do, because they're fearful that when the cops leave, there's going to be a reprisal from those people who they have told that they've seen commit crimes.
I definitely get what you're saying there. So you're saying the criminal element is intimidating enough that people won't report crimes.
Exactly.
Okay. And I think that really makes a lot of sense, and I really do agree with the notion, that increasing police numbers will curtail crime. I just really hope that we decrease these numbers as we see results, especially if we can kind of deduce or conclude at least that it's been Krasner's policies that have gotten people out, repeat offenders, and increased recidivism that is causing the kind of issues that we see right now. And so I would say that in terms of in the net and in terms of individual circumstance, right, great portions of the Black and minority communities, and as an extension, just urban communities in general, they're more likely to be compromised by the criminal element, either as a victim or as a perpetrator. And so, deploying the police, I don't want to criminalize innocent people, kind of what you're saying there. And I think in concept, while stop and frisk is useful in preventing crime, it does assume every time that you're a criminal. And so I can understand the sentiment that we're kind of talking about there, where someone would be against stop and frisk or react in a certain way about it, especially as the media kind of touts this narrative, that the police are out to get you. And one thing I think is interesting is how we have a lot of these transplants. There's a lot of people in the city of Philadelphia that are police officers that don't live in the area,
Right.
aren't from the area, aren't used to handling these issues day to day. And so I think we agree that that's a social issue, that there aren't men and women standing up in these communities to combat crime. And so what do you think you could do to get people bought into the idea of policing in the city so that they become police officers themselves?
That's a very good point, because a lot of our young people, before they run afoul of the law, I think that they need to know that those are viable options if you want to be a police officer, if you want to be a fireman, if you want to be in other types of law enforcement, that those careers, you can pursue that and make that your life calling. Having said that, the elementary school and high school students need to be approached early on. When these kids get to the 3rd, 4th, and 5th grade, at that point, the police need to come in and have programs specifically designed to help these young people know that you can be a law enforcement officer yourself. And this is what law enforcement officers do. This is our day-to-day regiment. This is how you can help give back to your community. much like the ROTC does in high schools and colleges and universities throughout the country. They come in and they introduce an alternative to perhaps an academic career. But they come to the colleges and universities and say, hey, listen, you can go into the service and become an officer. And here's what being in the Air Force, here's what being in the Navy, Army, and Marine Corps, this is what it could mean for you and a career path if you want to have a family, if you want to get back to your country, and if you want to serve in a greater capacity. So I think that needs to be done both in the elementary and high schools at a greater concentration.
So you're pretty much saying that we need to reinvigorate the American spirit.
Yes.
And to get black communities to buy into it. And I think I always make this argument, especially when I'm talking about it in terms of capitalism, is that, black people for centuries were denied access to free market capitalism. And instead of giving them access to it in a proper way, we've pretty much given them ample access to the nanny state, and the nanny state coming in and taking away the ability to be the ability to fend for yourself and take responsibility and accountability for your own life. So I totally get what you're saying there. And I think it has a lot to do with the degradation of values. Obviously, it's a multi-issue problem, like you're saying, and I think we've pretty much hit everything there. And so maybe it's not necessarily a question of the system. I do worry, though, how a cop's personal bias could impact how they treat somebody. We have political, economic, social biases that exist. I worry in the event that a racist cop does have the ability to act out malice, as we may have seen. But I think once we divorce these issues of race, we can actually start to talk about them. I think the hyper-focus on race in this country is kind of what has degraded that American spirit, because it's very taxing to sit there and overanalyze everything that's going on. And you can look at the world with a lens, with rose-tinted glasses, and you can look at it with the worst kind of tinted glasses. The outcome is going to be whatever you think it is,
right,
and whatever you're putting in your head. And so I think my question for you at this point would be, what are we going to do to mitigate the idea that, officers do have immense power here? And I think Trump kind of got the ball rolling there in terms of banning chokeholds across the boards, and maybe in terms of police misconduct, how we're putting that in the databases. Do you think there's a little bit more that we could do in terms of reform in order to give police less power over the individual? After all, they are private individuals who are given a little bit higher of authority than most of us. What do you think we can do to prevent them from acting out, with corrupt motives?
Okay, better training, higher pay, because I think when you got police officers making $50,000, and you have a entertainer or athlete making $50 million, disproportionately, of course we live in a capitalist society, but that disproportion there's such a large gap between a guy making $50,000 who's going to run into a burning building or going to run into gunfire, and a woman who makes $50 million because she has a great voice. There needs to be a re-education, or we need to rethink how we're going to pay these officers, give them better pay, give them better training, so that down the line we can start to weed out some of the bad officers. Will you weed out every bad officer? No. Will you weed out every bad doctor? No. Will you weed out every bad lawyer? No. There's going to always be a bad seed in every occupation, in every profession. However, cops, because they control, they have the power of life and death over the people that they're policing. I think there needs to be a higher concentration, on the pay, and I think there needs to be a higher concentration on the people that we recruit and hire. And there needs to be better training, that once they become police officers, that they have continuous training so that you can weed out some of the bad seeds.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And I really think in terms of the conservative movement as well, we're starting to see changing tides in terms of policing. I think a lot of conservatives in some ways kind of do give police the role of judge, jury, and executioner, and are very comfortable with doing that. I innately think that goes against everything this country stands for. especially because there's not a lot of precedent in terms of policing, as we've seen in terms of our Constitution and the law. And so, just briefly bringing this back to the questions of race and talking about divorcing these issues of race, we're talking about the degradation of values, like we said. And so, I think where you and I split with the left is how we view these types of solutions respected the geographic communities. So, like, a community can be predominantly white or predominantly black. If there's poverty and there's a disabled family unit, then I think crime will follow suit. Black and white boys alike, young men in general, are just acting out in waves of intense violence. I think the conditions and the modus operandi could be different. The criminal element in the cities is arguably different than what a criminal element in the suburbs would be. But I think once you divorce it of race, you realize that young men, if they don't have anywhere to put that energy, they can become violent. And so I don't want to really compare the two, but I see in terms of, young men 18 to 23, it seems killing people is just okay. And where I'm at with it is that, I really believe that, a mass shooting in suburban America is no different than a mass shooting on Broad and Market.
Right.
How do you think we can successfully divorce these issues of race, considering that the conversation is so geared in a direction that really wants us to harp on it?
Now, what I'm about to say is radical, and your team might look at me now and say, this guy is really off his rocker, which I am. Let's put that disclaimer out there. I am a lunatic in terms of what I'm about to say. The press is biased. The press is not geared to putting out the right narrative, and that when they perpetrate crime and poverty and violence based on what the race of a person is, that sells. Race sells. So if you have race hustlers like Al Sharpton and Jesse Jackson who thrive on always keeping something racial even when it's not there. So how do we combat that? We begin to teach our children that they are Americans first, and that they ought to respect people of all colors, of all races, regardless. Children, if you put two children there, you take a black kid that's 3 years old and a white kid that's 3 years old and put them in a sandbox, they don't see race. They begin to play together. Race and racism is taught by adults who begin to say to the kids, I don't want you playing with him, or I don't want you playing with her because she, and that's where the problem begins. So how do we combat that? We begin to teach the adult society that people ought not to be judged based on the color of their skin. We have to get that message across. So we need more conservatives, I believe, in media. We need more conservatives in academia. Most of your colleges and universities are not welcoming to conservatives because they feel as though that their message is contrary to the message we want to bring. So you need to have more competing voices.
Right. I think you're very right there. And I mean, I have some notes here about like sociology and the criminology community. Like they're very focused on the relationship that race, poverty, and the disadvantage, like how it all correlates. And yet, like, is there a correlation? Absolutely. In Preventing Youth Violence, it's a sociology book written. It's argued that because of these disadvantages, minority groups and impoverished communities are so alienated from the mainstream culture that they turn away from it and act out in terms of crime. Even like disregarding the racial element there, I think this has a lot to do with the family argument that we've been making here. And so my question is, how do we reinvigorate the role parents play in their children's lives? So you're talking about adults there. And how do we reteach parents there that have been pretty much as degraded as the communities currently are,
Excellent point. Parents need to have free reign, as I say, to teach their kids both good and bad. But what do I mean by that? Parents are not perfect. Parents sometimes teach their kids things that may not be appropriate, but they ought to be given that allowance to make the mistakes, to teach kids that, hey, you might teach a kid that when somebody hits you, hit them back. Now, some parents will say, oh, no, that's not right. You go tell the teacher and let the teacher handle it. There are other parents who say, no, if a kid hits you, you hit him back, because in life, when you get hit, you're going to have to hit back. So again, those are different messages. I don't know if one is right and the other's wrong. They're just different messages. But parents need to have that leeway to be able to tell their kids that. Also, parents need to have that say in their kids' lives to say, hey, my daughter, Ann, thinks she's in the wrong body. She's in the 3rd grade. What in God's name does she know about being a boy? Except that the people are telling her, well, if you're in the wrong body, we can take care of that. We don't have to consult with your parents. If you want to start mutilating your body, or if you want to start taking these pills to change your hormones and so forth, we're here to help you. That's not the solution. The solution is letting the parent say to the child, hey, you might feel that way now, but a year from now, you may not feel that way. They have done studies, 85% of the children who are growing up with this, I'm in the wrong body and I want to become a boy, I want to transition to something else. 85% of them that are now 18 and older have regretted the decisions they made when they were younger. Now, yeah. So because I may have a 11-year-old kid who says, you know what I want to be? I want to be an astronaut. Then he might get 16 and say, I don't want to be an astronaut. I want to be a librarian.
Kids say the darndest things.
Kids say the darndest things. And kids change their mind from day to day and from year to year. So why do we assume that the parent should be ousted out of these decisions? The parent, should be the primary focus when it comes to decisions of sexuality for their own children. And the parents ought to be able to say, hey, I don't want my son or daughter reading filth or reading pornography in the schools. So, I think there has to be less bureaucratic influence and more influence from the parents. Does that mean the parents are the be-all, end-all? Of course not, because parents are not perfect. They're human beings who make mistakes. But they ought to be allowed to make mistakes, because that's a part of life too. We make mistakes, we do things in error, and we try to correct the wrongs that we've done. And that's something that the liberals don't understand. They think that everything ought to be a utopia and a panacea. Life is not like that.
No, right. That's actually a really good point. And I didn't really intend on getting into gender theory today, but I think what you're saying, you successfully built the case for parent choice, where our public institutions are kind of selling themselves out to these niche ideologies. And look, I'm very empathetic to what these kind of people have going on. In fact, I think we need to be more open and loving to them as a society. Although I think when you start to take the ability, like you're saying, any role in your child's life, or any part of a child's life, a parent should have a role in. And so when you slowly diminish the parent's value in that stake there, and you give it in the hands of the state, well, what kind of things is the state going to be telling our kids?
Right.
And I'm all for open discussions, and I'm all for academia really picking these things apart. But why are we putting these things in 8 to 9-year-old, 10, 11-year-old kids' heads? Right. And so I think you've really built a heavy-handed case for school choice there. You are a school choice candidate.
I am.
Would you mind just explaining briefly what that means to anybody who might be apolitical and doesn't know what it is?
School choice is when you say to the state and to your respective school district or school board, I want to have control or more control over where I send my child. I don't want to send them to a failing neighborhood school, but I want the monies that are available to use within the school district and taxes that we pay to send my child to a school that is successful, a school that is private. Perhaps they want to send them to parochial school, or perhaps they want to send them to another public school that has a better success rate and that fits the needs of their child. For example, if my child has shown or demonstrated the ability to do math, I want to send him or her to a school that specializes in mathematics or specializes in STEM programs, which is science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. So I want to send my child to a school like that, where I know it's not only their interest, but the school is successful, as opposed to sending them to the neighborhood school where I'm forced to send them, where it's failing and the teachers are not going to adequately teach them subjects of their own interest.
So, really good explanation there. I think anyone who doesn't know what it is totally going to be able to understand now. It was recently reported, or it's not even reported, like it's facts now. Josh Shapiro line item vetoed an $100 million stipulation on the recent education bill that would actually give money to kids, school vouchers to kids, so they go and attend better institutions. What are your thoughts on that?
I'm going to temper my thoughts on Josh Shapiro individually. As a governor, I don't know what his motivations are. I know some people who know him, and I don't know how great he's going to be for the state. However, I do think that if that program of school choice is an item that Pennsylvanians have access to and are able to send their kids to their school of choice, I'm all for it. However, I'm not sure in this political environment that we are currently in, because we have a divided House and Senate. The Senate is controlled by Republicans. The State House is controlled by Democrats.
Exactly.
And a Democratic governor. That's a bad mixture.
And it's like Shapiro made a backdoor deal here. Realistically, like he basically said to the Democrats, like, pass it along. I'm going to get rid of the school choice line item there, and that's really what he did. In that same swing, though, he provided universal, like, we're going to get universal free breakfast in all our public schools. In a school choice world where everything is just school choice, maybe we don't punish the public schools that are doing the best they can do, and we keep it as is. But what I will say, though, is, like, what resources are we going to carry over from the publicly funded schools? Like, for instance, if I do live in the city of Philadelphia and I'm getting bussed out to, like, Archbishop Carroll High School in Radnor, I believe, are we going to provide buses for these kids? Like, that would be my big question. Like, things like that, food, buses, etc.
Yeah, I think that needs to be part and parcel of the overall program. So when the administrators sit down and figure out how we're going to do this, that those questions need to be answered, as well as how much parent input is that parent going to have. Are you going to provide them access to go out to Radnor to attend the Radnor school district hearings and so forth? So are you going to give them the provisions to go out when they have parent-teacher night? Perhaps there's some struggles there in terms of transportation. Are you going to provide transportation so that the parent can still be actively involved with that student's life? I think those things need to be taken into account, as opposed to saying school choice. But there needs to be mechanisms to make sure that the school choice is also parental involvement.
Right.
So.
And I think that's really what it's about, is reinvigorating, like we kind of started this whole thing on, parent involvement in the students' lives, and also parents to have accountability on their own accord.
Exactly.
And I really think school choice does breed that, and not only that, in a world with gender theory, with critical race theory, things that I think are worthy points of study, but a parent should have the ability to decide if that is something that their child is going to be consuming. And so I totally hear you out there, and I think making those resources available is one thing that's going to get the ball rolling there. Alternatively, I think many critics of this point towards instances of cronyism, where a private school is going to put in a dean that's going to yield a really high salary, probably more than the teachers do, and he might not be qualified, or they might not be qualified. How do we mitigate cronyism? Is it even something to worry about, considering we have public school deans who are yielding like $300K a year? So what do you think about that?
I think it's a situation where, again, and I'm going to say this and sound like a crazy, but we don't live in a perfect society. Cronyism happens. We saw recently where some celebrities had been locked up because they had given bribes to school administrators to make sure that their kids got into certain schools that they perhaps were not qualified for. Those things happen because we don't live in a perfect world. And so, again, I don't say we should not worry about it. We should have oversight committees to kind of mitigate that. But those things are going to happen simply because we don't live in a perfect world. And those imperfections that we see, cronyism, nepotism, and so forth, they happen in a society on an even wider scale. There's some people who are hired for jobs in the private sector that they may not be qualified for, but they get those jobs because of who their father or mother is, i.e., Hunter Biden. He's not qualified to do any of the
Right,
stuff.
right.
So we know that he got those jobs with Russia. He got the job with China because of who his dad was. But those things happened. Are they right? No, they're not. And we can on the other end make amends for that. But those things happen in a less than perfect world. Although we don't live in a perfect world, let me say this in closing. We don't live in a perfect world, but the best thing going of any society is the USA. I would not want to live anywhere else but the United States. Is the United States perfect? No. Do we have a horrid past as it relates to racism? Yes, we do. But we're the only country that has ever had a civil war to rectify the stain of slavery. No other country could say that except America. So again, we try to right our wrongs from within. So we're not perfect, but we are a more perfect union than any other country on the face of the earth.
Right. And I think what you're saying there in terms of the cronyism is like, yes, it's a reasonable grievance to have, but that's no reason that we should be landlocking these kids in these institutions
Exactly.
that have been failing them. That's actually like a really, really good point. And so I guess my question then, especially in terms of the breakfast programs that Josh Shapiro is supporting right now, do you think that, like, in terms of there's food deserts in a lot of these Philly communities, do you think that the government plays a role there in determining if a community has access to nutritional food, if kids should have breakfast at schools, or do you think that takes away from a parent's ability to fend for themselves and their family?
I don't know if it's either or both and, but I do know that the government sometimes oversteps its boundaries. And I do know that when it does that, the parents will withdraw and not become as involved in their children's life. If the school's going to provide breakfast for my son or daughter, then I don't need to provide breakfast for them because they're going to eat at school. But that's not the solution. It should be both and rather than either or. The parents should make sure and should be the parents should be led to believe that, hey, I want to provide for my own son or daughter, but that if when I can't provide, I know I have a stopgap or I have a safety net that the school will help where I can't do. So it needs to be both and. I don't think we need to overstep our bounds and push the parent out.
Yeah.
So again, and that there has to be a fine balance with that.
And even in terms, it's a very good point. But even in terms of what you're saying about the United States, I'm always under the impression that humanity has been divorcing itself of the state for at least 2,500 to 5,000 years. And you can really see that. So when people do want to extend the power that the state has and the role that it plays in our lives, it's intriguing, but I'm trying to understand because if you look at the ball of progress and you move things all the way in, like, classic economics, Adam Smith and not saying that Smith himself was laissez-faire, but I think humanity's movement, at least since the birth of the Roman Republic, has been separating ourselves from these governing bodies, separating ourselves from the camera, from the war chest. And so when you put these responsibilities in the hands of the government instead of in the hands of families, like you're saying, they're not going to do it themselves.
Right.
Fast forward 25 years, I guess lastly, and I guess this might play in your role as a religious leader, it seems that many of the institutions or many of the issues with school choice are like grounded in the idea that kids are going to end up going to Christian institutions or aren't going to be going to the public institutions. They would prefer kids are in more secular institutions. And so, look, I went to Catholic school my whole life. I'm not necessarily practicing now. I think back on times where, my values have definitely been impacted by my involvement with the Judeo-Christian culture and education. Do you think it matters if kids go to a Judeo-Christian school or a secular institution? Is it a non-issue that children who might not be Catholic or Christian are attending Judeo-Christian schools?
I think it's important that they attend Judeo-Christian schools. You get a different result. You get a different kind of adult. But should it be mandatory? Of course not.
No.
People should be allowed to go where they want to go. If they want to go to non-sectarian or what have you. But I think what is important across the line is whether they choose a Christian school or a non-Christian school, there needs to be a curriculum that allows the student to understand that they're blessed to be in the greatest country in the world, that they're blessed to be in a country where people of all races, all ethnicities, all religions can come together and live in harmony. Uh, we are one of the few societies where Muslims live among Christians, who live among people who are atheists. And we all get along because we live in America, and we want mutual respect. Most people in America just want to live their lives and be left alone, regardless of what religion they may ascribe to.
Wow. And I think that's a really great point. And for the record, like when I attended Catholic school, like there was always kids who didn't necessarily go up for communion at mass or go and receive the Eucharist or go to confession, and they assimilated with us just fine.
Right.
So this idea that we're totally okay with indoctrinating kids with literally any other thing, but God forbid we teach them about God, right?
Right.
And so I think that's a really great note to wrap up on, honestly. And so, Reverend, I have one question for you. I've heard
Sure.
you asked it one time before. Are we on God's side, or is God on our side?
Depends on where you're standing on the football field. If you're standing at the 50-yard line, or if you're standing at the goal line. When we're standing at the goal line, we look back 99 yards and say, God was on our side. When we're at the 50-yard line, we look down the field 50 yards and see how far we have to go in order to score a touchdown, we say, I have to be on God's side because there's no way I'm going to make it from here to the goal without God's input. And so I do believe that God is involved in the affairs of men and women, and I do believe that God is on the side of America. But I do believe that because we have withdrawn ourselves from God, in a general sense, where there have been, it's in subcommittee now, in the United States Senate, there was a discussion of taking off on the back of your money where it says "In God We Trust." They wanted to take that off the money, off of your currency, to say, "Oh, we don't ascribe to any particular." Now, when you go to court, you used to say, "Do you swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?" They've taken that portion out, so help you God. So when we divorce ourselves of God in our society, on those small levels, I think you begin to see the erosion again of the nuclear family and of respect for and mutual respect for other people who may be different from you and may look different from you. But when we put God first, I think that helps us to respect people of all religions, of all faiths, whether they even have a faith or not. I respect atheists' right to say that there is no God, as they should respect my right to say I do believe there is a God, and I believe in the God of the Bible. So I think we can coexist, and we've proven that we can coexist. And I haven't seen that anywhere like you've seen it in America. And I've had the opportunity to visit some of the other European countries, and I'm not denigrating them or saying they're not. I've been to Spain. It was okay. I stayed there for a week, vacation. I've been to Brazil, stayed there for a week. These were okay visits. I've been to a couple of other countries that I've visited. I've been to Mexico and so forth. But I have to tell you, America is the greatest experiment on the planet. And it still is because of people like you and I who can sit down. A white Catholic and a black Baptist can sit down and have mutual respect for one another and a mutual admiration for one another. Only in America can you see that kind of microcosm and being expanded. Do you not know in America 11% of all marriages are mixed marriages, people of mixed races? No other country can say that. Mixed race couples, it's expanding because you're seeing more people of color and more people who are Caucasian and more people who are Hispanic marrying people who are Asian. So you don't see that anywhere else. All these other countries like China and Japan, those are homogenous countries where you see most people who look like themselves. But only in America do you see that, especially when it comes to marriage. Marriage, 11%. That's, you may say, oh, that's not a lot, but 11% of all marriages are mixed couples. That speaks volumes of the greatness of America.
It does, and that's why I think it's such a wrong thing to villainize America or vilify America, because when you really kind of think about things, this is the only country in the world where you can get status no matter who you are. Other countries, particularly European countries, have a caste system based on where you're from, what your economic background is, and so it's very true. I mean, is it perfect? No. But this is the only country in the world where if you don't have status, you can get it.
Yes.
And I think that's the most important way of looking at it. Mm-hmm. And I think when we degrade those values, like we're talking about this entire time, you degrade people's ability to get that status and to earn it. And so we talk about God, we talk about the degradation of values in our communities. And I think nihilism is really what we're up against here. Mm-hmm. That, especially in Philadelphia, where it's, I leave my house, the street is dirty, something happened down the street from me, there's no luck. There's no way for me. There's no light at the end of the tunnel. Mm-hmm. Again, like, not that I'm necessarily a practicing person of faith, although I realize when we tap into those themes that are almost universal, that are in our motherboards, to realize like this is timeless knowledge. Like biblical knowledge and insight is timeless.
Yes,
it's never going to go anywhere. Once people tap into that, and I think whether or not they're Christian or not, but as we're talking about how, the government really just wants to make everything totally secular, definitely wrong. What I will say, I guess, in conclusion, is that you're right. I think America is probably the one place on earth we can get as much opportunity as we have here. I think programs like school choice, as you're saying, while we agree and concede a little bit that there needs to be work done, they help us see that message through.
Right.
That everybody's in this, not for themselves, everybody's in this to be strong for themselves and their families so they can uplift their communities themselves. And I think that is the conservative message.
Yes. Yes, it is. That I know what's best for my life. I just need you to step aside and allow me to do what I think is in the best interest of my family.
I really want to thank you for coming on today. It's been a pleasure.
It's been my pleasure too, Quinn, and thank you for providing me this opportunity. I appreciate it.